Hi, welcome to another edition of Open Mic. I'm Mike Morse. Today we have Dr. Burton Bentley, an emergency medicine physician who started a company called Elite Medical Experts. Dr. Bentley is a strong advocate of helping the wrongfully convicted and believes access to experts at trial is a serious contributing factor to innocent people going to prison. Let's bring Dr. Bentley on right now.
You never know who you're going to see,
Be one guy one-on-one my whole career.
what you're going to hear,
We got a lot of desperate people in the city.
or what they've got to say.
When you can take people inside of a crime.
That's what you're going to hear on my podcast, Open Mic. Find it where you find your podcasts.
Mike, good to join you. Thanks for having me.
It's my pleasure. I'm always happy to talk to medical experts such as yourself who believe that there is something seriously wrong with our criminal justice system. So, Dr. Bentley, you're at the University of Arizona right now, is that true?
Well, I'm about 9 miles away from the University of Arizona in Tucson.
So that's my alma mater. I love Tucson, so that's another reason I wanted you on. One of my colleagues here wanted, well, we'll talk about Tucson after. Let's get started on what possessed you to get involved with helping innocent people get freed from prison.
Well, that may be a little bit more of a story, but I'm an emergency medicine physician, and I was raised in a family where my dad was an attorney, practiced for 53 years. So I always had quite an interest in the law for a long period of time growing up that way. When I got out of medical school and became a physician, I began consulting in a lot of different medical legal areas, and we can get into that a little bit, but that could involve everything from medical malpractice to personal injury cases. That evolved over the years into aligning other experts to testify in these matters, and that opened up the door to a number of cases that have involved criminal defense. And that's, I think, what you're alluding to now is how do we sort of step into that realm.
Right. I mean, look, we experts, my office, we have thousands of cases. We use medical experts all the time. It's helpful to explain to juries and judges why we believe a certain position. Experts are needed in civil cases. But on our podcast, we've been talking a lot about wrongful convictions. And one thing that we have found is that a lot of people are wrongfully convicted because they're indigent. They have bad lawyers. These bad lawyers don't seek proper experts to combat the prosecution's experts because the prosecutions have unlimited money. It's the government. They have unlimited money. They have 5, 6, 7, 8 experts saying why the person is guilty of the crime. And the indigent defendant is sitting there alone with sometimes a bad defense attorney who hasn't read all the medical, hasn't consulted an expert, and they're doomed. And so your company has helped provide experts for indigent defendants, am I right?
Yes, so that is one of the things that we do. So again, we consult anywhere at the intersection of medicine and law, and one element of that has been on these cases where there's been an issue, if not an outright deprivation of access to some authority within your case, whether it's on a fine forensic point or even just a general point. It is astonishing how often either these facts are just glossed over because an expert isn't brought in or not really thought about. And that goes back to some of this imbalance in justice. Depending on who you are, you may have access to the best experts in the world, and at the other end of that, depending on who you are, you may have access to no experts. And that's really not the scales of justice being tipped in a fair way.
So do you have any, what was it, what can you tell us a bad story about having to step into a case where they didn't have an expert and you were able to provide some insight and enlighten the jury to a good result?
Well, we're actually in the middle of one right now that's pretty intriguing for a few reasons. So if you've got a minute.
Sure, please, let's hear it.
What happened? So there's a man in prison right now in Ohio named James Brenson, and he was convicted of murder, aggravated robbery, kidnapping, stemming from an episode that happened in 2000. So what had happened at that time is that there was a man in Ohio who was viciously murdered, had been stabbed 51 times. So really a very dramatic type of a homicide. And Mr. Brunson had been there that evening at the man's home, purchasing fireworks, has not disputed that in any way. And we know a lot about what was going on at the time because as he had left the home, he was pulled over by police about 40 miles away or so for a license plate issue. So the police spoke with him and let him go, and then he continued back on his way to Toledo. So he's got a pretty airtight alibi, meaning he's at the home in the evening, and he's pulled over at some point driving away. And so we know where he is that evening. But what was fascinating on this case and what caught my eye, and that might bring us back in a moment to how I got involved in this case in the first place, but what caught my eye on it is I was just intrigued by the homicide itself. So again, I'm an emergency medicine specialist. I've dealt with a lot of pretty gruesome forensic situations. But in this one, there was such a degree of what we call overkill. It's what we often see in a crime of passion, for example, where someone's really emotionally involved. And if you think about it, if you're robbing someone, hopefully you don't hurt them at all, but maybe you hurt them a little, but you certainly don't stab them 51 times. So there was just something unusual about the nature of that, but there's a very technical point, and the point on it is that when they looked at the decedent, the victim of this crime, in his stomach he had 5 pills from his medication, and that struck me because of a few reasons. That meant he had taken the pills pretty proximate to the time he was killed. And it always reminded me in my career in emergency medicine, just the suddenness with which our lives change. Nobody wakes up in the morning saying, hey, today's the day I'll have an aneurysm, or I'll have that heart attack or stroke I've been thinking of, or I'll get hit by the bus. Things happen so suddenly. So here's a man who takes his medication, and before it can even be digested, he's stabbed 51 times. But here's how that ties into Mr. Brunson. It came up at trial that the man takes his medications in the morning. So if he takes his medications in the morning and the medications are still in his stomach, it looks like he's killed shortly after taking his morning medications, not 10, 11 hours earlier when we know Mr. Brunson was there. Mr. Brunson couldn't have been there in the morning. And we have documentation of that. So the way we got involved with this is probably the most intriguing part of it. So Mr. Brunson wrote us a letter that arrived at my office from the correctional facility in Ohio. And we typically aren't taking cases in that way. So I don't want to put us out there as write to us from across the country, because
Right.
That's what we do. That's just,
Right. You'll be opening up a Pandora's box there, but go ahead.
we will not open that Pandora's box. So again, our 99.99% of our cases are just coming from law firms. So this envelope sat there for a little bit and got opened, and I looked at it, and it was the autopsy that caught my eye and the pills that caught my eye. I was just intrigued by it. That led me to just read through the rest of the letter. Mr. Benson really done an incredible job, not only detailing his history, but actually putting trial transcripts into the letter. And they never focused on the pills. That trial.
So this is a man who's already convicted, probably a life imprisonment or a high sentence.
He is convicted in 2008, 30 years. He's 68 years old right now. So he's already been in there for 12 years. And when I looked at it, I was stunned. I couldn't understand how nobody addressed the issue of these pills, because you've got 5 pills. And these pills are so fresh, they can identify what they are. It's the man's morning potassium pill.
Wow.
So it's not even that it's some dissolved crazy thing and nobody knows what it is, and we're using DNA. That's not what this is. You're looking at someone's stomach and there's 5 pills that they just swallowed. That's compelling that he's killed pretty proximate to having taken those pills. And we know from testimony he took his medication in the morning. And it just struck me as, how could this not have been looked at? So that opened up just a rabbit hole of going through years and years of what happened to Mr. Brunson, going through trial transcripts. Truthfully, he's been his best advocate. I'll be honest, I don't know how he does it. Gets trial transcripts, data, puts things together. But what it's culminated in most recently, and this is why it's on my desk now, is just earlier this week. This case has been going on about 18 months that I've had it. Earlier this week, I have an affidavit now from a professor of forensic pathology who was able to go through it, go through the state's medical expert who was their medical examiner who had done the autopsy, go through her testimony, go through what happened, put together an entire affidavit and say something doesn't match here. So again, the way that an expert works is not his job to say who killed the victim. It's his job to say, let me look at the evidence and see if we can put some bookmarks, maybe on a time of when this could happen. And those bookmarks clearly put it in the morning when we know Mr. Branson wasn't there.
So I assume his attorneys in Ohio will be filing a 6500 motion, a motion for relief from judgment using your affidavit that you were able to procure from this forensic pathologist to show that there's new evidence, a new theory, asking the judge for a new trial or a release, of course. Is that my understanding correct?
That's it. So the first step, again, on our end, is always just at the medical level. I've got to get through the medical facts and make sure we're on the right side of it. So unlike a defense firm whose job is to just represent their client, sometimes at all costs, our job is not that. Our job is to really look critically at the facts, understand, do they support our theory? Are they against it? So we're not here necessarily to advocate. I'm here to get to the bottom of it. But now that we've gotten that far, now that I've got a top tier voice, a very renowned forensic pathologist, now we can jump back onto the legal wagon and get things moving again. So those will be the steps.
Very exciting. Well, good luck. Good luck to this gentleman down in Ohio. We are, the expert witness stuff is so important. In Michigan, we have a law the Michigan Supreme Court passed not too long ago, in the last few years, that said that these type of criminal cases, if the prosecution is bringing expert witnesses against the defense must provide expert witness testimony. And that doesn't, and the cases that I'm reviewing from 2000, 2010, there are several cases that on, for example, shaken baby syndrome cases where the defense attorney just thought that they could, do a cross-examination and that would be enough. And without providing expert witnesses, when a jury hears 5, 6, 7 experts, treating doctors, expert witnesses saying this person committed a shaken baby syndrome or the head trauma, the new diagnosis, abusive head trauma, without expert witnesses. How crazy is that to you to hear that defense attorneys try to defend somebody without an expert? Tell me your take on it, since you are an expert and you provide experts to defendants and lawyers across the country.
I think it's crazy. In fact, I'm in the middle of writing just a blog article that's on what's called the battle of the experts. And where that expression comes from, it's actually an expression that attorneys use routinely, even though we're in the expert realm. Attorneys always talk about the battle of the experts. So I just Googled it on a legal site, and that term had come up 147 times in the last however many years, just in the articles they had cited. And it really struck me that, indeed, that's often what we have. So to be in court unopposed, meaning the opposing counsel has brought in even one expert, much less 2, 3, or 4. If you don't have an expert, forget the facts. There's just that appearance. There's the showmanship of what occurs in trial. It's unbalanced. It looks like you couldn't produce someone to defend your side. So you've already got one strike against you. And that's before we even get into the facts of the case, whether you're just being deprived of justice for knowing the true facts of what occurred, having someone really look through it impartially and say what's here and what's not. So we see that happen fairly routinely. And it's particularly common in the area of child abuse. So what occurs in child abuse is obviously there is, by definition, an injured child. So a child has some pattern of trauma. And the question is, really at its core, is that what's called inflicted trauma, meaning brought on by someone else's hand, or is it accidental trauma? So if we just bridge it right there, kind of make a Y, it's either inflicted or it's accidental. So the presumption, obviously, in child abuse is that it's inflicted. That's how we got.
Because the child couldn't have inflicted it on himself.
Because the child couldn't have inflicted it on himself, would be one thought. And then by the time it's in a legal construct, it's because somebody is informed, Child Protective Services, law enforcement is involved. So we're already at the point where someone's saying this is child abuse. So by the time that we've gotten there, the odds are a little bit stacked against you because people have already taken it through a few different medical levels, and now law enforcement is involved as well. So the question is, now that you're in the crosshairs, is it child abuse? Is it inflicted, or is it accidental? And what we found is that years ago, there were a lot of things we looked at, patterns of injury, where we said, if you have this injury, then it is child abuse. There's a word in medicine called pathognomonic, and long word, but what that basically means is something is so specific for something. If you see it, it means that thing. So, for example, years ago, we would say that if you had a spiral fracture, instead of a bone snapping cleanly or being cut in half, so to speak, it's a longer fracture, sort of curves down the bone. Spiral fractures are generally there because there's a twisting, torsional force on the bone. So the thought is that has to be inflicted. Someone's grabbed someone's leg or arm and twisted it. But we know now that spiral fractures can occur, not as commonly as with twisting, but they can occur in other mechanisms. What I'm getting at is, if you have a spiral fracture, that is not 100% proof that it's child abuse, that it's inflicted. It can occur accidentally. But there are a lot of people, years ago, accused and convicted of child abuse based solely on the presence of a spiral fracture, for example. So the thought now is, let's just investigate the facts. Let's remove the assumptions that we're making, the prejudice that we may bring to it, the emotional overlay, because it's a child. I mean, I trained in pediatric emergency medicine as well as athletes, so I'm pro children. But let's step away from that for a moment and just look at what really happened. And if the facts suggest this isn't exactly what it appears, then someone has the right to have those facts come to the surface.
Right, and that's where the battle of the experts come. Rather than leaving a jury with the understanding that the prosecution has 7 witnesses, medical doctors, saying this person shaked the baby, I don't know the right word there, dropped the baby, hurt the baby, the jury, in my opinion, it sounds like your opinion, has to hear the other side that, yeah, well, that might be most of the time, but there are circumstances when a baby can fall and hurt themselves off a bed or a swing, can get hurt in other ways, can have a some kind of process going on in their brain that can create some of these injuries that appear to be done by a person that could have been natural, could have been a fall. And jury, it's up to you to decide who's telling the truth.
Correct. So the expert's role is to shed light on the event and to educate the trier of fact. But the expert is, as you obviously know better than anyone, is not the trier of fact. We're not here to decide innocent, guilty, did it, didn't do it. We're here to go through some complex information so that someone else gets to make that decision. So 2 thoughts on what you just said. The first is that there are certainly cases of child abuse. So let's be frank that a lot of children are clearly the victim of child abuse. So it's not a matter of just looking at every case going, oh, not child abuse, defendant. Certainly that's not what we do. We're starting again with a clean slate. So I want to be impeccable with my word that the important thing is to look at it so that everyone is treated fairly, whether that's the victim, who's the child, or the child's family, or who's ever being accused, even the investigators who are investigating. So it's not about having a preconception. So if the facts don't support that, and it does appear to be child abuse, and that happens in a lot of our cases, we share that very, very openly because the legal team and their client need to make a decision about what to do with that. I'll give you one very interesting example of a recent case that we got, and it's a baby that had an incredibly suspicious pattern of head trauma, bruising, swelling, all of these things. I mean, if you look at it in 2 seconds, it is child abuse. There's no way that the kid got this. It's not from a fall. It's not from anything else. So I'm looking at it going, not going to be able to help a lot on here. And this shows you how that was my preconception before opening the file.
Well, you're an emergency room doctor. Let's stop for a second. You must jump to conclusions when you were practicing in the ER every day. You have to make split decisions every day, 10-hour, 12-hour shifts all day long.
Not only do we, but with child abuse or elder abuse in particular, there's statutory requirements, legal requirements that bind us to report even a suspicion of child abuse. And that's a really important distinction in emergency medicine. It's not that I'm putting on my forensic hat and my medical legal hat and I'm making some determination. The law is very explicit. If I even suspect child abuse, I will be held liable if I do not report it to authorities.
Wow.
So we report it all the time, and that's common in all states, and that's obviously for the public protection. Going back to this baby, though, with the bruises, here's what's fascinating. And it just shows how important it is to really enter these things with a clean slate. The family's claim is that the baby frequently bangs its head on the crib. So we hear that all the time as child abuse defense. I didn't do it. The baby, jumped off this or jumped in front of the car, or, fell off the ladder or did whatever. I didn't do it. In this one, though, they said the baby always did that, and we have video. And I thought, well, what in the world does that mean? Well, they have baby cameras that are set up in their room that have recorded it. And this baby can hold onto the crib and go ballistic, banging its head on the crib. And
wow.
We recorded it thinking, if one day this baby gets hurt, someone's going to think we did it. And
holy moly.
I'll be honest, I've never seen that in a case. What's the chance you've got something like that? It's just truthfully doesn't happen. In fact, that's never happened in one of our cases. But in 2 seconds, my mind had to do 180 degrees, and I go, my gosh, I've got not only a plausible theory, but I've got the most probable theory. In fact, I think I've got the answer. Still, I don't even want to be overly biased by that. We've got to still delve through the facts, look at the injuries, because just because a child's doing that, you can still be mad at the baby, pick the baby out of the crib, and still abuse the baby, correct? So, again, our point is to really go through the entire body of evidence, but that was one of the most striking things that I've ever seen.
That is fascinating, and it goes to show it's not always as it seems at first glance. The battle of the experts that you mentioned, whether it be a civil case that I work on or a criminal case that I'm starting to work in this arena that we're discussing here, if I'm a juror and you had to give a lecture or write a blog of telltale signs of how to tell which expert's telling the truth, because you're going to have an expert for the prosecution saying, it's white, it's white, it's white. And you're going to have a prosecution for the defense saying it's black, it's black, it's black. And they're both going to be from nice universities. They're both going to be board certified. They're both going to have nice white hair like you do and look the part, okay? The battle of the experts, So how do you know who's telling the truth in these cases?
I think that's so fascinating, really at its core, and maybe for your listeners, they'll appreciate that simply by virtue of the fact that a case has come to trial, there must be two opposing sides that have made it that far. And so, to your point, they're both going to march in experts. And the question is, does that show reasonable minds can differ? Because I've got expert A and expert B, and they're 180 degrees apart. Or is just one person a paid advocate for one side? And I think it gets confusing to a jury when you hear someone say X and someone says Y, and they both swear to it under oath, under penalty of perjury. So there's so much that goes on in the expert world that I think is fascinating. But I guess when I'm looking for telltale signs, and by the way, as part of what we do in our business, I'm often working at that end of things, preparing for cross-examination, looking at the opposing experts, what they're going to be saying, and how to be impactful and actionable and anticipate what's going to come out. So one of the telltale signs that we always think of is sort of an advertised expert, meaning they're not a medical professional. They're not someone who's there to educate the trier of fact in the interest of justice. There's someone there earning a living. So there's a lot of telltale signs to that, but that's typically what we call an advertised expert, someone who's got a shingle out there. I'm Dr. Smith, legal expert. We don't do that. So certainly in our world, in my consulting, that's the biggest no-no. So,
Hold on, let me just stop for 1 second. Are you saying that you're experts, you don't have any experts that you present that are earning 100% of their income from being an expert?
correct. That would be impossible. And that's a little unique to what we do. So every expert.
Well, hold on. There are a lot of experts that make their living off being an expert.
Correct, except in the medical field. So if you're an engineer, for example, and your whole life is around tire blowouts and how the rubber literally meets the road, absolutely, you've got to advertise. How would anyone know that you're out there? But a physician or surgeon shouldn't do that. A physician or surgeon should have a full-time clinical practice, treating patients, being in the operating room, teaching, training the next generation, research, being active, board certified, licensed, practicing. That's the most rudimentary threshold, the most basic we have. So, in fact, if you look at our website, you'll see there's no button to click. Are you an expert? Sign up with us. We don't have a database. The reason is I found in thousands of cases, and we're north of about 8,000 for both plaintiff and defense. What I found is that that's the quickest way to improve the case, is to have the case focus on what a crummy expert you have. Because when you don't have a case, when you can't focus on the facts, you focus on tearing apart the opposing expert, because it becomes a distraction. So why put that out there? So in each case we align with, not only is the expert board certified, not only are they in full-time practice, but they're exactly aligned for the case and the facts and the theory. And they have a spotless background. We've even checked social media. I can't have someone who's got a crazy video out there. What if they've got a podcast like this, but they're saying nutty things?
What if they do TikTok dances?
Well,
I'm just kidding. I do those. But anyway, but your experts are getting paid thousands of dollars to give expert testimony.
correct. So all experts get paid. Plaintiff experts, defense experts, or experts for prosecution or defense.
All right, so let's leave aside the money. How do you tell who's telling the truth when they're both, like I set it up, they both look good, they both have good credentials, and they disagree on the cause, effect of the truck accident, the motorcycle accident, the cause of death of a shaken baby? How are jurors supposed to know?
Well, that's the inherent difficulty, and that's why counsel on both sides is putting those experts forward to create that murky environment, and I think it can be exceedingly difficult. And these are complex issues. So if you think about it, the reason that an expert's there, literally at its core, is because the issue is so complex, it can't be decided by a layperson, just a person without any knowledge in that area. It requires expertise to even shed light on it. So how does someone who knows nothing about that area, meaning a juror, suddenly have to make complex decisions about which expert is telling the truth? So I think there is an inherent difficulty in that system. Again, it's just always the credentials. I don't want to believe the paid hired gun. Your point was that, well, both experts are being paid, and that's absolutely true. Doctors typically aren't donating their time, although some do. But there are some doctors who literally earn a living, meaning a major part of their income, if not all their income, from testifying. That doesn't work in the medical field. Physicians and surgeons need to be practicing. If you're just out selling testimony, you're what we call a paid expert or a hired gun, and that always ends up in the crossfire in court and just takes the expert out. So assuming we've got two equally matched experts, if they reach an exact opposite opinion, you're exactly right. That's sometimes the goal of the trial attorneys, to show, hey, reasonable minds can differ, or there is no clarity here, or you can't decide to a reasonable doubt because we've got two great people here and they're both saying opposite things. But I think a lot goes just to the character of the expert again and the credibility of their testimony. How believable for a physician, how likable is that person? How do they resonate with the jury? And there's countless times where juries are interviewed afterwards, and it really did come down to, man, I just liked that expert, or I trusted that one, or boy, that's a doctor I'd let treat me. So we're very particular about that when we're aligning experts in litigation, because there is a reality to this battle of the experts. And if you're about to have a battle, by definition, only the best expert's going to win. So I think, again, picking the right expert and then preparing the expert. So you can have the best expert in the world. If they're not prepared to articulate the facts, you're doomed. And if your expert's not prepared to address weaknesses, to take them head on, not every case is clear cut. For example, on the bruised baby case we just talked about a moment ago, maybe some bruises are 100% explained by what we're seeing on the video. Maybe there's some that aren't. We can't pretend like those aren't there. So I'm a fan of addressing or conceding weaknesses, not trying to brush them away, because all of a sudden when the other attorney is asking you questions on cross-examination, all of it's going to come out. So again, being an open, honest educator, sticking to the facts, not overly advocating, meaning obviously you're there to tell the story, but not blindly just going through it. So how do you speak and resonate with the jury, I think, is really important.
Okay. So one of the last questions I have for you, we've talked about the shaken baby syndrome, abusive head trauma cases. I am getting involved in that. Future shows will be about that. I have signed up to help a gentleman try to get a new trial who's been convicted of this, who did not have any medical testimony at his trial. I am a believer that he did not get a fair trial and that we're going to try to help him get a fair trial. But more details on that to come. You have some knowledge about a specific type of expert, a child abuse pediatric expert. Why don't you tell our listeners about what that is and what those credentials are?
Sure. So when we're looking at shaken baby cases and people say, I need an expert, the question is, what's an expert? Is that a pediatrician? Is it a neurosurgeon? Is it from any one of a variety of fields, even emergency medicine, because we probably see the most kids that are just coming in after an initial injury. So we like to really explore a case at a lot of depth to decide which pieces do we need, because it can be incredibly specific. What's interesting is there's a field that a lot of people have not heard of, and it's called child abuse pediatrics. So child abuse pediatrics is a subspecialty of the field of pediatrics. And these are physicians who are trained in recognizing and dealing with patterns of injury. And because many of those cases ultimately culminate in legal issues, many of them are quite used to testifying and being involved in a forensic capacity, meaning tying the medicine into the legal issues as well. I'm surprised how many people have not heard of that field. It is a newer field, but we're seeing it more and more in cases. What's interesting with it is if you just think about it, if you've decided to devote your life to being a child abuse pediatric specialist, you are by definition an advocate for children and are typically getting called in day after day after day to look at different patterns of injury in kids, many of whom have been the victims of child abuse. What we sometimes find them with that specialty is that it can be difficult almost, and this is a little unusual. I mean, their job is to decide, is it abuse? It can be difficult almost for them to cross over and say, let me back up. Let me really look at this impartially. Let me decide, is this truly, based on every fact, indicative of child abuse? So what's interesting is it's very, very easy to get them on the prosecution side because obviously there's an injured child. And so if someone takes the low-hanging fruit, that expert can easily say, yep, it's abuse. What's fascinating, though, is when you get one of these experts whose whole life is about defending kids, looking at patterns of abuse. When you get one of them to say, ladies and gentlemen, this isn't abuse. It's really one of the most powerful things you can do. I'll share with you, it's often challenging because by the time the case has gotten that far, there's obviously facts stacked against the defendant. But when you can pull that magic lever, it's pretty impactful, and that expert carries quite a lot of weight.
Now, but that type of expert, how does that expert have time to treat? You mentioned that, you're looking for experts who are treating physicians, and then they do kind of the expert work on the side for whatever reason, but they're doing expert work several hours a month for various reasons. What kind of background does a child abuse pediatric expert have? Are they pediatric doctors, surgeons? What's the background there?
Yes, so they have to be a board-certified pediatrician as the lowest threshold. So some are also emergency medicine specialists in pediatric emergency medicine. Some are just in pediatrics, and that becomes part of their practice. So again, they're still full-time practicing physicians. So I'll go back to what I said a moment ago. In the medical realm, the biggest no-no is to have the professional expert or the hired gun. We don't do that. We can do it in engineering and other fields, but not medicine. Physicians in the courtroom need to be full-time practicing, licensed, credentialed, certified. So expert work should just be a tiny part of what they do. So if you think about it, cases can stretch on for years. So absolutely, a case might take you 20 hours over 2.5 years. I mean, that's beyond part-time.
For sure. Well, as we get deeper into making sure that justice has been provided to individuals who are sitting in prison, I'm sure we're going to have more questions for you. I'm sure we're going to need to bring you back on and potentially bring on some of your experts to discuss some of these very important issues that are placating our criminal justice system. I mean, recent studies have indicated that as many as 10% of the people in prison could be innocent. And we don't know how many of those people didn't have the right experts, couldn't afford experts. And I mean, I'm sure if I ask you the question, do you think if they all had really good experts, could that number be decreased? You'd say,
there's no doubt. So having excellent representation, both by your attorney, but then backing that up with the right voices, meaning experts, is always going to be the key in these matters, for sure.
Right. I agree with you. So we'll be talking more about this in the future. Thank you for being with us today. It's been a pleasure meeting you, and I look forward to continuing this conversation in the future.
Mike, that was fun. Thanks for having me. Glad to come back anytime. Thank you.
Well, there you have it. Someone who is devoting his life to making sure civil trials and criminal trials have the right experts. Dr. Burton Bentley was fascinating. And if you enjoyed this episode or you know anybody who needs expert witness services, please forward this episode, like the episode, comment, subscribe to our YouTube channel and our podcast channel. And thanks for watching and listening to Open Mic.